Here, taste it.
And half the fun is making it ourselves.
Thank goodness it's Friday.
Time off when he doesn't make a mess is when he makes his chocolate milk with...
They looked weird. They smelled weird. But in the 1980s, we loved every bite. Before food photos ruled the internet, taste mattered more than appearance, and the 80s didn't hold back. Cringe now if you want. But back then, this was the good stuff. Let's start with something that probably lived in every grandmother's fridge like a permanent exhibit. Green gelatin mold with mini marshmallows and canned fruit. If you grew up in the 1980s, this dish was as unavoidable as shoulder pads or TV dinners. You would find it at church potlucks, holiday parties, and any occasion that needed a touch of festivity, which apparently meant suspended pineapple chunks in a sea of lime green wobble. And do not forget the marshmallows, mini, chewy, and absolutely out of place. One spoonful, and you were not sure if you were eating dessert or chewing through an alien specimen. And yet, it worked. The sweetness, the chill, the weird bite of tinned mandarin oranges. It was oddly refreshing. Kids loved it, grown-ups pretended to, and nobody questioned why it existed. Because this was the 1980s, and we were still figuring things out. But if you think that was strange, wait until you remember the one meal that taught kids how to cook with cold dough and sweet tomato paste. Yes, we are talking about pizza Lunchables, the lunchbox legend that promised freedom and served up rubbery crusts with sugary red sauce. These were the height of elementary school prestige. You walked into the cafeteria with one of these bad boys and suddenly, you were royalty. The crust was always just a little too chewy, the pepperoni slices were more like soft coins than meat, and the cheese, a bag of shredded hope. But we ate it up like we were in an Italian bistro, not sitting on a sticky fold-out table under buzzing fluorescent lights. The real kicker was that sweet pizza sauce. It was not savory. It was not spicy. It tasted like if ketchup got promoted. But kids loved it, and honestly, so did parents. No cooking, no cleanup, just instant cool points. If the 1980s had a taste, it was this. But that was just the beginning. Because after lunch, there was always something colder waiting in the freezer, wrapped in nostalgia and a little bit of wax paper. That something? Pudding pops. These frozen treats were pushed hard in the 1980s, especially with the endorsement of a certain TV dad who made them sound like a miracle. They came in small boxes, neatly lined up like frozen soldiers, ready to do battle with your summer boredom. You peeled back the paper and there it was, your chocolate or vanilla or swirled rectangle of mystery. The texture was unlike anything else. Soft, but not quite creamy. It never fully melted. It just kind of surrendered. And the flavor? Well, it did taste like pudding. If pudding had been shrink-wrapped in a freezer for a month. Still, that was the magic. It was the kind of dessert that made you feel like you were in on a secret. Like, sure, ice cream was great, but this was different. Better even. You would get that little chill up your fingers from holding the wooden stick too long, and it was all part of the experience. But frozen desserts were just one side of the story, because when it came to drinks, or should I say drink-themed everything, one name ruled every lunch tray and mess hall in America. Tang. Glorious neon orange Tang. At one point, this stuff was just a drink, something astronauts allegedly loved. But in the 1980s, Tang broke free from the cup and made itself known in ways nobody saw coming. Summer camps were ground zero for Tang madness. There were Tang slushies that stained your tongue for hours, Tang pancakes that were supposed to be orange for fun, and in some truly bold cases, Tang as a glaze for grilled meats. You heard that right? Sweet, tangy citrus powder turned into a barbecue marinade. And you know what? It was not half bad. It had that sugary, artificial citrus taste that somehow felt more real than real orange juice. Tang was a badge of honor. You drank it before a game. You stirred it with a spoon that bent from the effort. It foamed at the top and was somehow better that way. But for all the bright flavors and childhood hype, Nothing screamed "Mom tried" like the next dish. It was hearty, it was crunchy, and it always had that one crusty edge that you kind of feared, but still ate anyway. Behold the meatloaf with ketchup and cornflake crust. This was not your grandmother's meatloaf. This was the suburban legend of dinner tables across the country. It had flair. It had crunch. It had that weird mix of sweet ketchup glaze on top and slightly dry beef at the bottom. But the real star? Those crushed cornflakes. They were supposed to give it texture, but mostly they just gave it attitude. You never really knew what part of the loaf you were going to get. Would it be the soft middle, or the slice with a ketchup caramelized top so sharp it could double as a weapon? Either way, it was dinner. And Mom made it with love. And a lot of patience. The cornflakes were a budget-friendly way to bulk things up, and the ketchup glaze was like the icing on a very confused cake. But it worked. We ate it, we enjoyed it, and we lived to talk about it. But if that meatloaf made you feel like a king, the next dessert made you feel like royalty. It shimmered, it crunched, and it came straight out of the freezer with a name that whispered luxury, even if the taste said otherwise. Behold, Viennetta ice cream cake, the crown jewel of store-bought sophistication. If you were a kid in the late 1980s or early 1990s and this thing appeared at your birthday party, it meant your parents were fancy. One look at those elegant, wavy layers of vanilla ice cream and paper-thin chocolate ripples, and you would swear it was the kind of dessert reserved for royalty, or at least suburban moms who read Good Housekeeping. It came in a box that promised elegance, and somehow we believed it. The texture was as light as air, almost like the cake version of breathing in freezer frost. And that delicate crunch between the layers? Heavenly. Of course, it melted immediately, so by the time it was sliced and served, you were basically eating sweet soup with a chocolate shard. But no one cared. You felt grown up eating Viennetta. You felt rich. Even if the taste didn't quite match the presentation, it was all about the vibe. Still, Viennetta only showed up on special occasions. For everyday childhood decadence, we had something a little more radioactive and a lot more compartmentalized. Let's talk about TV dinners. The metallic tray, the peeling plastic film, the meal that looked like it was assembled by a robot with questionable taste. These were not just dinners. They were events. You would hear the oven beep, pull out that tray, and stare in awe at the lumpy Salisbury steak, a pool of neon mashed potatoes, some confused corn, and of course, the brownie fused permanently to the peas. That brownie. You either got it molten lava or hockey puck, no in between. And the peas? Somehow still cold, still green, and still welded to the dessert like edible glue. But it was convenient, and that was everything. You could eat dinner while watching cartoons. Total victory. No plates, no fuss, just a fork and your knees as a table. And while the food had a unique taste, somewhere between school cafeteria and airplane, it had charm. Odd charm. But if the TV dinner was the king of convenience, then Heinz's next great experiment was the court jester of food colors. It is time to revisit a color-coded fever dream: purple ketchup and green mustard burgers. Heinz thought kids were bored with normal condiments, so in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they dropped a product line that looked like it came from a cartoon alien's lunchbox. The idea? Make burgers fun. The result? Pure chaos. Squeezing grape-colored ketchup onto your cheeseburger felt like you were violating a sacred rule of the universe. It looked like slime. It smelled like ketchup, but it tasted exactly the same. Your brain just refused to trust it. Same thing with the green mustard. Put that on a hot dog and tell me it doesn't feel like something you should be doing in secret. But kids loved it. The novelty, the weirdness, the gross out your sister factor. It was all part of the charm. It was the food equivalent of putting on a backwards cap and saying, radical. Eventually, people grew tired of neon food that made dinner look like Nickelodeon Slime Time Live, and they returned to something far older and far weirder, something that wobbled when it moved. Yes, it is time to honor the shimmering legend. Aspic on trays from Grandma's church potluck. Imagine gelatin. Now imagine chicken trapped inside it like a fossil. That was aspic. A savory jelly made from meat stock and collagen, aspic was the vintage food hero that somehow held vegetables, meats, and unspoken family tension in one dish. Picture a ring mold filled with floating peas, carrot slices, maybe even ham cubes, all set in a wiggling, flavorless suspension. It was like biting into a cold, savory Jello salad with a hint of fridge. And yet, it was fancy. Served on silver platters, garnished with parsley sprigs, and brought out with pride by someone who whispered, "It's an old family recipe." You had to nod, smile, and pretend you liked it while praying there was still room on your plate for something safer. But back in the day, that aspic was a mark of status. The more stuff floating inside it, the more impressive it was. Aspic may have been unsettling, but it was unforgettable. Just like the sticky little snack you could only get one night a year, and it came wrapped in waxy cellophane. Popcorn balls, homemade, rock-hard, and aggressively festive. If you were trick-or-treating in 1986 and ended up with one of these in your plastic pumpkin bucket, you knew exactly which house to blame. They were sticky, they were stale, and you could never eat one without pulling out at least 2 baby teeth. Made with corn syrup, butter, and whatever decorations the host had lying around, popcorn balls were the definition of good intentions, questionable results. They were wrapped in wax paper or plastic wrap, often tied with yarn or ribbon like a homemade grenade. You would try to eat them, you really would, but after a few bites, they ended up in the junk candy pile next to the peanut taffy. Still, there was something magical about them. They looked like Halloween. They smelled like burnt sugar and effort. And if your parents trusted the house they came from, you might even be allowed to eat the whole thing. But if Halloween was the season of sticky regret, then the rest of the year belonged to something far more painful. A pizza that doubled as a dental hazard. If your mouth was not burned by the end of dinner, did you even eat French bread pizza? These things were basically edible shrapnel. The crust was so hard it could double as body armor, but we popped them into the toaster oven anyway, usually on a bent cookie sheet lined with foil that had seen better days. They came 2 in a box, barely enough for a full meal, but just enough to convince us we were having a night of luxury. That sharp-edged bread, coated in imitation tomato sauce and an uneven sprinkle of cheese, was a rite of passage. The edges? Razor sharp. The center? Molten lava. You had to wait a solid 15 minutes for the inside to cool down, but nobody ever did. Instead, we chomped down, burnt our tongues, and still went back for seconds. It was not about taste, it was about the thrill. A pizza that could cut you and scald you? Now that was a meal. And if the pizza was not sharp enough, the real culinary chaos came from a dish so simple it barely qualified as food, but somehow it made perfect sense on a tired school night under the glow of cartoons. Slimy canned spaghetti on white bread. It sounds like something a raccoon might make during a power outage. But in the 1980s, this was practically gourmet if you were home alone with a babysitter who had one job: keep you alive until your parents got home. 1 can of spaghetti dumped cold or slightly microwaved onto 2 slices of stick-to-the-roof white bread. Boom! Dinner. The noodles were limp, the sauce was sweet and watery, and the bread soaked it all up like a sponge. But for some reason, it was amazing. It felt like a rebellion. You were eating like an adult, or at least how you thought adults ate. Add a side of high C or chocolate milk, and you were living the dream. It was messy, it was unbalanced, and it made absolutely zero nutritional sense. But somehow, it worked. The kind of work that keeps showing up in memories uninvited, like a catchy jingle you cannot shake. Still, even the weirdest spaghetti sandwich could not hold a candle to the flavor combo that came straight from rock and roll royalty and stuck around in more kitchens than anyone wants to admit. Let us talk about the wild, the weird, and the weirdly wonderful. Peanut butter and bacon sandwiches. Yeah, you heard that right. Creamy peanut butter spread thick on toasted bread, topped with salty, crispy bacon. a sticky, savory, sweet monstrosity that somehow became a comfort food classic. And before you ask, yes, Elvis Presley was a fan. The king of rock and roll made it famous, but it was the kids and families of the 1980s who turned it into something casual. You would come home from school, open the pantry, find that jar of peanut butter and a few leftover bacon strips from breakfast, and voila, dinner was served. If you were feeling extra fancy, you might add banana slices or even drizzle on some honey. The flavor hit you like a weird dream you did not want to wake up from. Rich, greasy, sweet, and salty all at once. It was pure indulgence, unapologetically so. You did not make this sandwich because you were hungry. You made it because you could. It was power. It was peanut butter. And it definitely was not the most processed snack on the list. That award goes to something you stabbed with toothpicks and pretended was a party tray. You know exactly what we are talking about. Bologna and American cheese roll-ups held together by a single toothpick and a lot of questionable confidence. No bread, no shame. Just two processed icons of the 1980s spiraled into what passed for hors d'oeuvres at school events and birthday parties. Bologna was the everyman's cold cut, cheap, salty, and suspiciously slick. American cheese was that neon orange slice that never melted right, but somehow still counted as cheese. You slap them together, roll them up like a meaty scroll, stab them with a toothpick, and boom, you had a snack. Sometimes people would go wild and add a pickle spear in the center. Sometimes it was just straight protein and plastic. Either way, it was delicious, in a way that probably makes your arteries wince today. But back then, it was fun, it was easy, it was everywhere. Your mom packed it for your lunch, your teacher brought it to the classroom party, your weird uncle made a plate of them for Sunday football, and somehow it always disappeared. But for all the sodium and cheese on display, the 1980s still made room for the healthiest-looking plate at the table until you realized it was mostly lettuce and illusions. The ultimate diet dish of the 1980s? Cottage cheese and a pineapple ring on a leaf of lettuce. That was the go-to lunch for anyone trying to feel virtuous without giving up creamy textures and sweetness. You would walk into any retro cafeteria, beauty salon, or office luncheon, and there it was. A bright green lettuce leaf, a thick ring of pineapple from a can, and a scoop of cold, wet cottage cheese plopped right in the center. If you were feeling extra, you added a maraschino cherry on top, because nothing says balanced meal like a sugar bomb on curdled dairy. This was health food by 1980s standards. It had fruit, it had protein, and it had that Midwestern visual flair that made it perfect for photo spreads in vintage cookbooks. But let us be honest, it was weird, cold, tart, and soft in all the wrong ways. Still, people swore by it. It was refreshing, they said, light and low calorie, and just upscale enough to make you feel like you were doing something right. But when dinner needed more flair, more sauce, more fun, and way less actual flavor, you reached for a cardboard box with a name you will never forget. Let's be honest, Chef Boyardee pizza kits were a fever dream of processed perfection. Inside the box, a dry, dusty dough mix, a packet of cheese that smelled like a middle school locker room, and the real prize, that tiny can of thick, sweet red sauce. It was like liquid nostalgia in tomato form. You had to mix the dough yourself, and it never rose quite right. It stayed oddly flat and chewy, like it was half bread, half shingle. Every kid felt like a master chef, kneading that sad lump of dough like it held Michelin star potential. The sauce was weirdly sweet, but it filled the kitchen with a smell that said, real dinner is happening. Even if the crust tasted like laminated cardboard, we pretended it was New York pizzeria quality. That little red can smelled so good it made up for everything else. The moment it hit the dough, the kitchen transformed into a 5-star pizzeria, in your mind at least. The cheese melted unevenly, the crust hardened around the edges like edible concrete, but the end result? Pure bliss. You had made your own pizza, kind of. It tasted like cardboard, sure, but it was your cardboard. And for a kid in the 1980s, that meant everything. Still, if you really wanted to impress your friends, or turn your birthday into a neon fever dream, you went straight for dessert. Specifically, a cake that looked like it belonged in a lab more than a kitchen. Jello poke cakes were radioactive, confusing, and completely irresistible. You started with a regular boxed cake, then poked holes all over it like you were playing whack-a-mole. Then came the real magic. Bright, syrupy Jello poured straight into those holes until the cake looked like a topographic map of a candy factory. The final layer? Whipped topping, cool and fluffy, smeared on like frosting's sweet cousin. When you sliced into it, the cake revealed colorful tunnels of gelatin running through every bite. One slice looked like a nuclear spill, and that was the appeal. The texture was equal parts sponge and goo, like cake with a built-in syrup injection. It did not matter if it was lemon lime or strawberry. Every bite tasted like fruit-flavored chaos. It was sticky. It was squishy. It defied texture in ways that still confuse scientists. Kids loved it. Adults pretended it was refreshing. And the best part? You could customize the colors. Red and blue for the 4th of July. Green and yellow for whatever holiday needed attention. The brighter the better. These cakes lit up the dessert table like fireworks. And even if they tasted like sugar-soaked kitchen sponges, they delivered exactly what the 1980s promised. Flash, fun, and just a bit of food-related confusion. Of course, if you were the birthday kid, there was only one way to top it. A boxed cake covered in a frosting so greasy, it should have had its own warning label. Flavored Crisco frosting was the stuff of legends and clogged arteries. This was the icing you made when butter was too expensive and flavor was optional. The recipe was simple. Take a mountain of vegetable shortening, add sugar, vanilla, and whatever food coloring matched the party hats. The result? A pastel cloud of pure fat that could survive a nuclear blast. It slid across the top of cakes like a thick, sweet oil slick. It was the kind of frosting that stained your lips pink or blue. And that was half the fun. You could taste the chemical vanilla from across the room, and it still made your mouth water. We did not know what natural ingredients meant, and we did not care. It was impossible to get off your fingers. And yet, we loved it. Every single bite coated your tongue in sugar and left your lips shining like you had just eaten a stick of lip balm. The frosting held up for days, maybe weeks, without changing texture. It was practically immortal. And it made those supermarket birthday cakes taste like childhood itself. Sure, it left a film in your mouth that no amount of soda could wash away, but that was part of the charm. And speaking of salty sweet charm, there was one snack that somehow crossed the line between cracker and full-on lunch, and no one questioned it. Not then, anyway. Chicken in a biscuit crackers were like eating pure salt wrapped in poultry flavoring. These little golden rectangles had no right tasting as good as they did. They were buttery, crumbly, and somehow packed with fake chicken essence in every bite. You could smell them across the room. One whiff and you knew someone had just opened a box. As kids, we ate them by the handful. As teens, we stacked them into sandwiches with cheese or lunch meat. They were snacks, yes, but also legitimate meal replacements when nothing else was available. Each bite was an instant mouthful of powdered, meaty flavor that no other cracker dared to imitate. They were crumbly, they were dusty, and they were absolutely perfect for eating straight out of the box. The seasoning stuck to your fingertips like a secret handshake between latchkey kids. The flavor was addictive, the crunch was satisfying, and they left your fingers coated in a savory dust that rivaled anything a chip bag could offer. Were they healthy? Absolutely not. Did we care? Not one bit. These crackers lived in the pantry next to instant noodles and canned ravioli, quietly waiting to save the day when dinner plans fell apart. And they always did the job. But if there was one thing more exciting than salty chicken crackers, it was cracking open a can of syrup so thick it defied physics and required tools. Chocolate syrup in a metal can was not a casual topping, it was a commitment. These were not easy squeeze bottles or no-mess pouches. No, this was a thick tin cylinder that required a special tool, the dreaded triangle punch. You would stab the top twice, once to pour, once to breathe, and out would come the slow, glorious ooze of Hershey's chocolate sludge. This syrup was dense. It glugged, not poured. It clung to your spoon like it was afraid to fall, but the taste? Deep, rich, almost gritty. It had soul. This was the stuff you drizzled over ice cream, stirred into milk, or just sneakily spooned into your mouth when no one was looking. It poured like lava, moved like molasses, and turned milk into a milkshake with just a few aggressive stirs. It was the kind of syrup that dared you not to lick the spoon afterward. Even the can itself smelled like chocolate dreams and old kitchen counters. It was earthy and dark, with a hint of bitterness that made it feel grown up. The can would sit in the fridge for weeks, growing stickier by the day, with syrup dried into every seam. But you never threw it out, not until you had scraped the very last drop. And for those of us lucky enough to pour it over dessert, we knew the real prize came after dinner, when dessert melted in your hand, stuck to your wrapper, and became a sticky, glorious mess you would chase down to the last bite. The ice cream sandwich wrapped in waxy paper was not just a dessert, it was a summer rite of passage. You would rip open that thin paper wrapper, and instantly your fingers were glued to the sides by soft, half-melted chocolate cookie layers. They stuck to your palms, left smudges on your cheeks, and melted faster than you could eat them. But that was part of the fun. The contrast between the frozen vanilla center and the slightly soggy outer layers was oddly perfect. The cookies were never fully crisp and never totally soft, just this weird hybrid that collapsed in the best way. And let's be real, no one ever ate these cleanly. You had to commit. You took giant bites, licked the edges before they ran down your wrist, and somehow ended up wearing half of it. They came from ice cream trucks, corner stores, and backyard freezers, and they were dependable. No bells, no whistles, just creamy goodness and a ticking clock before disaster struck. If you finished without getting any on your shirt, you were a magician. But if your dessert came from a can instead of the freezer, that was a whole different ball game, especially when the label had a little red devil on it. Let's talk about deviled ham spread from a tiny can. It was one of the strangest things to ever find its way between two slices of Wonder Bread, but somehow it earned its place at every oddball picnic and kitchen counter. The can was small, metallic, and always had a little cartoon devil on it, which felt equal parts charming and ominous. You peeled back the lid like you were opening a secret, and inside was a pinkish pasty meat spread that smelled like salt and something faintly smoky. You never quite knew what part of the ham you were getting, and you definitely did not ask. It spread like whipped butter, if butter was made from compressed pork and desperation. You slapped it on crackers, bread, or sometimes celery if your mom was feeling fancy. And you know what? It worked. It was oddly creamy, a little spicy, and very, very salty. It was the kind of food you would never bring to a party today, but in the 1980s, it was classy, or at least it was easy. And that was usually good enough. Still, for those who preferred something sweet, but just as suspicious, there was always a foil-lidded plastic cup of yogurt waiting in the fridge with a surprise on top. Peach-flavored yogurt with the skin on top was the 1980s version of roulette. You pulled back that foil lid with a hopeful heart, only to be greeted by a thick, shiny film across the top that looked like it had been sitting there since last Tuesday. That skin was a dividing line. Some kids peeled it off and tossed it immediately. Others? They loved it, scooped it up first, said it was the best part. It was a silent personality test. How you handled that skin said more about you than your report card ever could. It was glossy, weird, and weirdly satisfying. And honestly, that says a lot about us as a society. The yogurt itself was overly sweet, barely tart, and weirdly glossy. Peach was the go-to flavor, small, squishy fruit bits lurking at the bottom like sunken treasure. You had to stir it, but not too much. The goal was to hit the perfect mix of creamy and fruity, which rarely happened. Instead, you got lumpy, half-mixed globs that somehow still tasted better than they looked. And let's not forget the aftertaste, that unmistakable chalky tang that stuck around just a little too long. Still, it was a step up from pudding cups, and it felt healthy, which made parents happy. But if you were looking for a real treat and a sugar high that could fuel a bike ride for hours, you reached for a cup filled with ice and syrup straight from a gas station counter. Ah, Neon Slush Puppies, the unofficial drink of mall food courts and corner gas stations. You walked up to the counter, chose your color, not your flavor, your color, and watched as someone cranked the machine, pouring crushed ice into a wax cup, then unleashing a waterfall of syrup that pooled at the bottom like liquefied Skittles. Blue raspberry, cherry, watermelon, none of them tasted like actual fruit. They were sugar in its most chaotic form. The first few sips, heaven. Cold, tangy, and just enough syrup to keep you going. It was more chemical than drink, more experience than refreshment. You didn't just sip it, you survived it. But the real reward was at the end. After the ice had melted and you were left with that glorious inch of syrup at the bottom, you tipped the cup back and chugged it like a champion. That part hit like a sugar freight train. Too much and you would see stars. Your tongue would stay dyed for hours, and your teeth would hum from the sweetness. It was the kind of thing that made you feel invincible, or slightly ill. Same difference. But the 1980s were nothing if not bold in flavor. And no flavor was more suspiciously beloved than that one fake fruit we could not quit, no matter how much it lied to us. Artificial banana flavor. The one taste that united banana runts, banana taffy, banana pudding cups, and every banana milkshake that somehow tasted like crayons. But back then, we loved it. It was not trying to taste like a real banana. It was something else entirely, a flavor of its own, sweet, pungent, and so strong it took over your mouth like a chemical invasion. It didn't matter that it was fake. Maybe that was the point. It was so fake, it became iconic. Banana runts were always the last ones left in the box, until they became the first ones you picked because your taste buds gave up. Banana pudding, the kind that came in snack cups or school lunches, had that signature yellow hue and a custard consistency that clung to your spoon like it had feelings. It never tasted like a fruit. It tasted like nostalgia dipped in syrup. Banana Laffy Taffy was even more aggressive, chewy, tangy, and wrapped in a joke that made no sense. Still, we kept chewing. We kept licking spoons. Artificial banana was a flavor no one trusted, but everyone remembered. It was strange. It was addictive. And it was everywhere. But if you thought that was strange, just wait. During long campaigns, soldiers often had to rely on more than just their rations to stay fed. When the opportunity arose, hunting for fresh meat became not just a necessity, but a small victory in the midst of the hardships. Rabbits, deer, and wild boar were common targets. These animals were perfect for feeding a small group and could be cooked over a fire with minimal preparation. Roasting game was a simple process. After a successful hunt, soldiers would often skin and gut the animal, then roast it directly over an open flame or on a spit. The smell of cooking meat could be both a comfort and a temptation, scenting the air as a reminder that fresh food was not always a guarantee. While hunting provided nourishment, it wasn't without its challenges. A missed shot or a wounded animal could turn an evening meal into a frustrating effort. Hunting also brought a sense of normalcy during chaotic times. It was one of the few moments when soldiers could experience a taste of home, enjoying freshly prepared food, even if only for a brief moment. When meat was available, it was considered a prized delicacy, especially if the alternative was the more unappetizing, less exciting preserved food. Whether roasted over an open flame or eaten raw, fresh game was a rare but cherished reward in the soldier's diet. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. A pretty imaginative way of getting some familiar old flavors back into the weekly diet was mock food, specifically mock fish fillets. We're going to take a look this time at both this recipe and how exactly things like it became common. See, there's one thing about people from back then. While they definitely had it horrible, their circumstances really expanded their horizons in the kitchen. Mock culture was all about mimicking flavors of classic dishes with inexpensive ingredients. Stuff that was easy to get, wouldn't cut too deep into your pockets, and would also last you a good while. Mock fish fillets were actually made out of mashed potatoes. I really wasn't kidding when I said people really grew a newfound appreciation for potatoes. Recipes in cookbooks back then were using them in ways that the curly fries and hash brown-addled brains of you and I could only dream of. Still, there were times when even potatoes weren't available. In that case, they'd make use of bread. Now, you might naturally be wondering how bread even comes close to imitating the flavor of a fish fillet. Well, apparently, soaking it in some milk and mixing it with powdered eggs and flour actually forms a mixture that gets the texture down. Next, your spices: onion, parsley, pepper, and some pretty basic stuff, which was still easy enough to get. Though even those were stretched thin, spice cabinets would often run empty. Do you think this actually does the job? If you try it, share what you thought in the comments below. Stewed turnips were the kind of dish you'd find bubbling over campfires or hearths in military camps, especially during tough campaigns. Turnips, often overlooked today in favor of more glamorous vegetables, were a soldier's steadfast companion throughout history. They were easy to grow, quick to harvest, and kept well, making them an essential part of the soldier's diet. Root vegetables like turnips could be cooked in a variety of ways, but stewing them with any available meat or fat brought out their earthy flavor and provided much-needed calories. In times when fresh meat was scarce, the fat rendered from salt pork or whatever meat was available helped create a filling, nutrient-rich meal. Stewed turnips also had a long shelf life, making them ideal for soldiers on the move. It wasn't gourmet, but it was sustenance, and in the harsh conditions of war, that was often enough. While we might joke today about turnip stew, it was a crucial dish for many armies, offering a much-needed boost of energy to keep soldiers marching forward. A turnip could serve as both food and makeshift weapon. After all, it's hard to argue with a turnip's versatility. Cabbage and noodles typically just looked like a pound of cabbage and a medium serving of noodles. More or less, it was not the most expensive dish, and you could enjoy a bowl by making it pretty quickly. Away from the pancake and pie-addled fanatics are admirers of noodles across the states. Everyone needs their cravings satisfied from time to time, even if the soaring prices spared no one. In some areas, cabbage and noodles was known as haluski. However, in most places, it was simply referred to as cabbage and noodles, the most typical Depression-era noodle recipe. It's a must-have that needed to be in your repertoire if you were to survive the times and not forget every taste you ever loved. Someone really needs to study how times like these bring out everyone's culinary creativity. What's not to love about a 3-ingredient delicious sauce? White sauce was the comforting meal you look forward to coming home to every night. It was a break from the bland foods of the dirty 30s, and the best part? It required just 3 common ingredients that were already staples in everyone's kitchen: flour, butter, and milk. This sauce is like an easy-breezy addition of the bechamel sauce, which is one of the mother sauces of French cuisine. This sauce is made from a white roux and milk, seasoned with ground nutmeg. Since we didn't have fancy ingredients on hand, the simple ones did the job. This sauce was used to top pasta, vegetables, casseroles, and even lasagnas. If you were lucky enough to have a bit of cheese in your pantry, it could be turned into a cheesy sauce. If you had some herbs, it could be seasoned to add extra flavor. And let's be honest, in tough times, a little creamy sauce can make everything taste just a bit better. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, bubble and squeak really emphasize the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? Fermented foods were a soldier's unsung hero in the field because of their long shelf life, health benefits, and easy storage. Sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and fermented grains were common staples, valued for their ability to withstand harsh conditions without spoiling. And when you're out in the middle of nowhere, that's a pretty big deal. The process of fermentation, which involves converting sugars into alcohol or acids, offered a natural boost to the immune system. Fermented foods like sauerkraut are rich in probiotics, which help with digestion and overall gut health. Soldiers, especially during long campaigns, appreciated the natural preservation methods. Without refrigeration, these foods could survive months in storage, often more reliable than any other food they had on hand. While fermented foods may not have been the most exciting part of a soldier's diet, they served a crucial purpose. They were easy to transport, didn't require constant attention, and provided essential nutrients. After a long day in the field, a bite of tangy sauerkraut might have been a welcome change from the usual dried meats or hardtack. Fermented foods were a lifeline in keeping soldiers healthy, and often they gave a taste of home when nothing else could. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. We've got one thing straight: meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work, as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well, but when done right, it was totally worth it. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put 2 and 2 together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. Creamed chipped beef on toast, however, was a more happening kind of toast-based breakfast. Particularly fancy and skillful home cooks would smoke the meat sometimes to add a better BBQ flavor. Thin slices of beef in glass jars were all you needed, which were not too expensive, and the rest of the dish was completed with a creamy, thick white sauce. Meat lovers would use cayenne pepper, remembering days where they could spray it on their steaks instead of their toast. Comfort food was really lacking in the Depression times because most could not make theirs. Creamed chipped beef on toast was a wonderful replacement that we are still sad to see fade away to history. Depending on where you were, the dish was more rare because you would most often see it in middle to upper middle class households. Beef really was expensive back then, but nowadays lots of other beef-based breakfasts took its spot. During long military campaigns, soldiers needed food that could withstand the rigors of travel, storage, and time. Salt pork and beans, a combination that became a military staple, particularly during the colonial and Napoleonic Wars. Salt pork was the go-to protein for soldiers because it could be stored for months without refrigeration. The pork was heavily salted to preserve it, a method that also gave it a distinctive, sometimes overpowering flavor. Soldiers learned to love, or at least tolerate, the salty taste, especially when paired with the hearty goodness of beans. Beans, often the dried variety, were another long-lasting and easy-to-prepare food source. When combined with salt pork, they formed a simple, calorie-dense meal that could be boiled up over a campfire. Whether cooked with a little extra fat or simply simmered in water, this dish provided the soldiers with both protein and the energy to endure grueling days on the march. Of course, the meal was hardly a gourmet affair. In fact, some soldiers were less than thrilled by the monotony of it. As any soldier might tell you, when it comes to survival food, variety takes a backseat to reliability. Salt pork and beans delivered just that, reliable sustenance no matter the season or the conditions. Oatmeal cakes are a warm, fuzzy childhood dish that many might associate with visits to their grandparents. Failing economy on one side and grandma spoiling her favorite niece and nephew on the other. You just know they will always find a way, and lucky enough for us that the people of the times did it so craftily. In 35 minutes, you had a wondrous dessert to yourself that was quick enough to make after long, panic-filled days. Canned oatmeal on a soft cake glazed with an almond or peanut topping really set hearts on fire. Despite the cake's popularity back then, especially in the fitness and health community, it still did not stand the test of the time. Of course, it is a great way to spice up your oatmeal, regardless of how other breakfasts prepared with more culinary liberties taken would eventually replace it. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. This doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. In the Americas, soldiers didn't always have the luxury of fancy meals or fresh produce. Instead, they often relied on cornmeal, a staple that could be boiled up into a simple, hearty mush. Known as cornmeal mush, this dish wasn't exactly a gourmet experience, but it did the job, filling soldiers' stomachs and providing much-needed energy. The process was straightforward. Cornmeal was boiled in water until it thickened into a creamy, porridge-like consistency. Though plain, it was easily adapted. Some soldiers would add a pinch of salt, while others might include a bit of sugar or molasses if available. And on occasion, if they were lucky enough, a splash of milk or butter would make it a bit more palatable. Cornmeal mush was cheap, durable, and easy to prepare in large quantities, making it a popular choice during long campaigns. In fact, during the Revolutionary War, it was commonly served to American soldiers. If there was one thing they could count on, it was that their mush would be there to keep them going. While it might not have been the most exciting meal in the world, cornmeal mush was dependable. When you're fighting for freedom, or just trying to make it through another day in camp, sometimes simple sustenance is all you need. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. When supplies ran low and options grew scarce, armies turned to one of the simplest meals imaginable: gruel. A combination of ground grain, usually oats, barley, or wheat, and water, gruel was the ultimate no-frills survival food. It wasn't much to look at, and it wasn't much to taste either, but it got the job done. Gruel's strength was its efficiency. It required minimal ingredients, little preparation, and just a single pot over a fire to cook. This made it ideal for armies on the move or besieged soldiers stuck in fortifications. Plus, it could be stretched to feed large groups, which made it invaluable during times of scarcity. That said, calling it bland would be an understatement. Soldiers often described it as thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl. If you were lucky, you might get a sprinkle of salt or a scrap of fat tossed in for flavor. If you were really lucky, you didn't think too hard about what might have fallen into the pot along the way. Still, gruel earned its place in military history. It was cheap, filling, and easy to digest, exactly what armies needed to keep marching. Bean soup is different from the other soups on our list because, in contrast, bean soup was pretty simple to make. Dried red kidney beans in a thick soup made for a favorite of states like Idaho, where the dish originated from. You could find different ideas on the soup from house to house, as some had their vegetables as toppings and others had meats. Fred Dubois, who was Idaho's senator at one point, passed a bill that mandated the Senate restaurant to have bean soup on the menu every day. Definitely one way to start a movement if you ask us, but the trend definitely stuck around after it gained steam. It was an amazing way for low-income neighborhoods to eat healthy, but nowadays you would not find it in households as beans are not really the go-to item for soups. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? Next up, a dish that sounds almost too simple to be true: tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. I know, it doesn't exactly scream gourmet, but remember, we're talking about a time when people were just trying to survive. This combo was a way to stretch those precious few ingredients. During the Great Depression, potatoes were a cheap and filling staple, and tomato sauce was an easy way to add flavor. This dish was essentially a plate of creamy mashed potatoes topped with a savory tomato sauce. It might sound a bit unusual, but this combination was a hit because it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. Plus, potatoes were versatile. You could mash them, fry them, or bake them depending on what you had. So, if you're ever in the mood for a simple yet tasty meal, try tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. Let's see if this humble dish can impress our modern taste buds. The 1980s were messy, bold, and weirdly delicious. And honestly, we kind of miss it. Comment with the wildest thing you loved growing up, and if this made you smile, like the video and subscribe for more tasty throwbacks.